There is a quiet peace before the storm hits, and we are here to capture the thunder. Experience high-stakes drama and the intense emotions of life's most turbulent moments. Subscribe now and stay tuned for the cinematic storm heading your way. The night my husband told me he'd hidden the diagnosis, I was standing in our kitchen holding a casserole dish I'd just pulled from the oven. Chicken and rice. His favorite. I remember the steam rising between us, and the way he looked at me not with guilt, but with something closer to relief, like he'd finally put down something heavy and was glad to let me carry it instead. I didn't drop the dish. I set it down carefully, turned off the oven, and then I sat on the kitchen floor and didn't get up for a very long time. That's where this story starts. Not at the beginning, not at the wedding, not at the moment I first understood something was wrong. It starts on a Tuesday in November, with chicken and rice going cold on the counter, and me learning that the man I had built my entire life around had been lying to me for 2 years. His name is Daniel. We met when I was 31, at a work conference in Atlanta that I almost didn't attend because I had a head cold and had seriously considered staying home with NyQuil and bad television. I've thought about that decision many times since. Not with regret exactly, but with the particular vertigo that comes from understanding how much a single choice can unravel. Daniel was charming in the way that certain men are charming completely, fluently, without apparent effort. He remembered the names of everyone he spoke to. He asked follow-up questions. He had a laugh that made you feel like you'd earned something. By the end of the conference I was in love with him in that breathless, embarrassing way that you're supposed to grow out of after your 20s. And I was 31, and apparently had not. We dated for 2 years. He was attentive and funny, and when I told him about my father's death, and how I still couldn't drive past the hospital where it happened, he held my hand the entire time and didn't say a word, just let me talk until I ran out of words. I thought that was a rare thing. I still think it is. I just understand now that knowing how to hold space for someone's grief is not the same thing as being a person who will never cause it. We got married on a Saturday in June. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings. His mother, who I will call Margaret, stood in the receiving line and told every single guest that the flowers were not quite what she'd envisioned, loud enough for me to hear from 6 feet away. I smiled and thanked the caterer and told myself that all mothers-in-law had their difficulties. And that Margaret was simply an adjustment I would make over time. I did not, it turns out, have enough time. The first 2 years of marriage were good in the way that first years often are busy, optimistic, papering over small cracks with shared dinners and weekend trips and the general momentum of building a life. We bought a house in a suburb outside of Columbus. We got a dog, a large ridiculous golden retriever named Biscuit who destroyed 2 throw pillows and 1 section of baseboard before settling into being the best thing in any room he occupied. I was happy. I want to be clear about that. I was genuinely, completely happy, and I believe Daniel was too. The cracks I should have paid attention to were quiet ones. The way he deflected when I asked about his annual physical. I'm fine, I went, nothing to report. He always had a reason not to discuss it further. The way he took phone calls in the garage sometimes, which he explained as needing quiet, needing to focus, and which I accepted because I too sometimes needed to be alone to think. The way he stopped mentioning his father, who had died the year before we met, and when I asked, he would say simply, "There's nothing useful in going over it." I didn't understand what he meant by that until the night in November. He had stage 2 heart disease. Inherited, structural, the kind that doesn't announce itself with dramatic symptoms but sits quietly in the chest like a slow clock. And his cardiologist had diagnosed him 22 months before he told me. He had been attending appointments I didn't know about, filling prescriptions I'd never seen, adjusting his diet in small ways he attributed to just trying to be healthier. He had built an entire parallel architecture of truth inside our marriage, and I had walked through it every day believing I was seeing the whole house. When I asked him why not screaming, because I was too stunned to scream, just sitting on the kitchen floor asking him plainly why he said he hadn't wanted to worry me. He said his father had died of the same condition and that watching his mother grieve had been the worst thing he'd ever witnessed, and he couldn't stand the thought of putting me through that anticipatory pain. He said he thought he could manage it, handle it quietly, and by the time it was resolved I would never have needed to know. I asked him what resolved meant when you were talking about a structural heart condition. He didn't answer that. What I felt in those first hours was not the anger that came later. What I felt first was a kind of dislocation, like finding out that the floor you've been standing on is actually a painting of a floor, and beneath it there is nothing but air. Every conversation we'd had about the future, the second bedroom we talked about turning into a nursery. The trip to Portugal we were finally going to take next spring. The retirement plan we'd started adjusting, all of it reconfigured itself in my mind with this new information inserted into the center. This quiet ticking thing he'd hidden there. I slept in the guest room that night. Daniel knocked twice and then didn't knock again. The next morning, his mother called. I found out later that he had told her. Not recently, she had known for over a year. Margaret had known my husband had a serious heart condition, had known he was concealing it from me, and had said nothing. Had sat across from me at Thanksgiving and Christmas and a birthday dinner and said nothing. Had accepted casseroles I dropped off when she had knee surgery and said nothing. Had called me honey in that particular way she had, like the word was a loan she might recall at any moment, and said nothing. When I picked up the phone that morning, she didn't offer an apology. She said, "Daniel told me there was some upset last night. I think you're being very emotional about this, and I want you to consider his perspective." I hung up. I want to tell you that I made clean, swift decisions after that. I want to tell you I called a lawyer that week, that I sat down and calmly mapped out the practical architecture of leaving. But that is not what happened. What happened is what happens to most people when something they believed in absolutely turns out to be something else entirely. I froze. I went to work and came home and walked Biscuit and spoke to Daniel in the careful, surface-level way of two people who are both pretending the floor is still solid. I was waiting, I think, for something to clarify. For him to do something that made the decision obvious. For the fog to lift. The fog did not lift on its own. What lifted it was a Tuesday morning in February, 3 months after the kitchen floor night, when I drove to a routine dentist appointment and ran into my colleague Priya in the waiting room. Priya worked in my department, we'd had lunch together a handful of times, and she was warm and practical in a way that I had always found steadying. We sat next to each other waiting for our names to be called, and I don't know what it was exactly, the ordinary mundaneness of the waiting room. The magazines fanned across the side table, the faint sound of a drill somewhere in the back, but I started crying. Not delicately. The real kind. Priya did not make it weird. She handed me a travel pack of tissues from her bag, waited until I'd collected myself enough to speak, and then said, "Do you want to tell me what's happening?" I told her. In a dentist's waiting room, in 10 compressed minutes, I told her most of it. She listened the way Daniel used to listen, except that her listening was different. She was taking it in and sorting it, and when I finished she said, "You understand that what he did was a form of control, right? He made a unilateral decision about what you could and couldn't know about your own marriage. That's not protection. That's not love. That's deciding he knows better than you about your own life." I had been turning this over in my mind for 3 months, and no one had said it to me that plainly. I went home that evening and called a family law attorney. I want to be honest about what the separation looked like, because I think people expect these stories to have a clean break, the dramatic moment, the door slamming, the box of belongings on the porch. It was not like that. It was slow and exhausting and full of negotiations about who got the dining room table and who was responsible for Biscuit's vet bills for the year. He apologized, genuinely and repeatedly, in the way of a person who has finally understood that apologies cannot do the work he needed them to do. His mother called twice more, and the second time I let it go to voicemail and then deleted it without listening. My attorney was named Carol, and she was the most organized person I had ever encountered. She had a yellow legal pad with different colored tabs. She explained what I was entitled to with the calm precision of someone reading a weather forecast, and when I left her office the first time I felt, for the first time in months, like someone who had agency. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in October. I know the date because I'd taken the day off work and I walked out of the courthouse into unexpected autumn sunshine and called my sister, who immediately started crying, which made me start crying. And then we laughed at each other for crying. And it was the most uncomplicated 20 minutes I'd had in nearly a year. I moved into an apartment. It was smaller than the house by more than half. On the 3rd floor of a building that had a slightly aggressive amount of exposed brick, and I loved it with an intensity that surprised me. I bought a new couch.
I arranged it myself, moved it twice, decided I'd been right the first time, and moved it back. Biscuit, who had come with me in the settlement because Daniel had agreed without much argument, immediately claimed the left cushion as his permanent location and I let him. Recovery from something like this does not follow a schedule. I want to say that to whoever needs to hear it. There were weeks that felt genuinely hopeful. I was sleeping, I was cooking, I was seeing friends. I was going to therapy every Thursday with a woman named Dr. Okafor who had a rubber plant the size of a small tree in the corner of her office and who helped me understand that I was not angry at Daniel for being sick. I was angry at Daniel for deciding that I didn't deserve to know. There were also weeks where I sat in my car in the parking garage at work for 15 extra minutes before I could make myself go in. Both kinds of weeks were true. 14 months after the divorce was finalized, I met someone at my friend Claudia's housewarming party. His name is Marcus. He was standing by the cheese board looking at his phone with the mild embarrassment of someone who has just realized they don't know many people at the party, and I walked over and said, "I don't know most of these people either, I'm Claire," and he said, "Marcus, do you know what this one is?" and held up a small wedge of something on a toothpick, and I said I had no idea but that we should probably find out. And we ate 5 kinds of cheese while talking for 2 hours in the corner while the party happened around us. I did not fall headlong into anything. I want to be clear about that. I was careful in the particular way of someone who has learned, specifically and painfully, what carelessness costs. I asked Marcus direct questions on our third date, not in a prosecutorial way, but plainly. I told him there were things I needed to be able to say and have answered truthfully, and that I was aware this was a lot to front load on someone, and he sat there and said, "No, that seems completely reasonable. Ask me anything." So I did. And he answered. And what I found, question by question over months and not weeks, was that Marcus was a person who said what he meant. He was not perfect. He was impatient in traffic and he had a habit of starting podcasts and never finishing them. And he was constitutionally incapable of folding laundry before it wrinkled. But when I asked him things, he told me the truth, including when the truth was uncomfortable, including when it was about himself. 10 months after Claudia's party, I was pregnant. We were not married yet. This was not the plan, insofar as we had a plan. But Marcus sat next to me on the bathroom floor after the test, our bathroom floor. We had moved in together the previous spring and held my hand and said, "Okay. What do you want to do? Not what should we do? What do you want?" I noticed the difference. What I wanted was to have this baby. What I also wanted was to spend 2 nights in a complete spiral of terror about whether my body, my marriage, my life, could hold this new weight. And Marcus let me do that too, made tea both nights, asked the right questions, stayed in the room. We got married quietly, the following spring courthouse, a dinner after, with close friends, my grandmother's pearl earrings again, because some things deserve to be repeated. It was not what Margaret, had she been invited, would have envisioned. She was not invited. My son was born in August. We named him after Marcus's grandfather, a man named Theodore who by all accounts had been quietly formidable and had taught Marcus to cook. Theo, we call him, and from the first week he had a presence in a room that was entirely his own. He was loud and specific about his preferences from the very beginning, and I found this magnificent. He was 14 months old the first time I saw Daniel again. It was at a farmer's market, a Saturday in October, the kind of day that is so perfectly autumn that it almost feels staged. I was carrying Theo on my hip, pointing out pumpkins he couldn't name yet, letting him grip my fingers and try to walk in the unsteady plunging way of new walkers, when I turned at the end of a stall and there he was. Daniel had not seen me yet. He was standing with a woman I didn't know, looking at a display of apple cider, and I noticed in the 2 seconds before he turned that he looked genuinely fine, healthy, present, unburdened in a way I hadn't expected. I felt something complex about that, which I sorted out in therapy the following Thursday and which mostly resolved itself into, I am glad he is alive, and I no longer want to be the person beside him. Then he turned, and saw me, and looked at Theo, and I watched something shift in his face, a rapid private calculation, the kind you can't quite suppress, his eyes going to Theo's size, his age, and I understood exactly what he was calculating. He walked over. His partner hung back, which I respected. He said my name, and said I looked well, and looked at Theo again, and said, "Is that how old is he?" I said, 14 months. He did the math visibly. He had the grace, barely, to look ashamed of himself for doing it. I said, "His name is Theodore. He's Marcus's son. We've been married for 2 years." He said, "Right. Of course." I just yes. Of course. There was a long moment. Theo, unbothered by all of it, made a grab for my jacket zipper. I said, "I hope you're doing well, Daniel. I genuinely mean that." And then I walked away, Theo on my hip, toward the cider stand at the other end of the market, and I did not look back. I bought a gallon of Honeycrisp cider and a small decorative gourd that Theo later tried to eat, and I called Marcus from the parking lot and told him what had happened, and he listened and then said, "Are you okay?" And I thought about it honestly for a moment and said yes. I was. There is something I want to say about what came after. Because I think it is the part that matters most. And the part that is hardest to explain. The betrayal I experienced in my marriage was not physical violence. It did not leave marks anyone could see. What it did was quieter and in some ways harder to explain to people. It took the private language of the marriage, the specific trust of two people who have decided to build a life together, and it falsified it. Daniel made me a participant in a story without telling me what the story was. He made decisions about my life without including me in them. I spent a long time in therapy understanding why I hadn't seen it sooner. The answer Dr. Okafor helped me reach was not satisfying or simple. It was this. I had confused consistency with honesty. Daniel was consistent. He was reliably present, reliably affectionate, reliably kind in all the visible ways. I had understood those things as transparency. They were not the same thing. What I know now, specifically and with great certainty, is what honesty in a marriage actually feels like when it is practiced fully. It is not always comfortable. Marcus and I have had hard conversations, real ones, about fear and money and what we want our lives to look like and what we're afraid of. Those conversations are sometimes difficult. They have never left me sitting on a kitchen floor wondering what else I didn't know. Biscuit is 9 now and moving more slowly, and on weekend mornings he positions himself between Theo and the back door with the determined patience of a dog who has decided that whatever is happening, he is part of it. Marcus makes pancakes on Saturdays. Theo requests them by climbing onto a chair and patting the counter with his open hand. Which is not technically a word but communicates everything necessary. I am 38 years old. I have a marriage I trust and a son I adore and a dog who has eaten 3 couch pillows across 2 apartments and 1 house. And I work with a domestic violence outreach organization now on Thursday evenings, helping women navigate the paperwork and the phone calls and the particular bureaucratic fog of the early stages of leaving. I do this because Priya handed me tissues in a waiting room and said something plainly true. And because Carol laid out my options on a yellow legal pad. And because being helped clearly, and practically in the middle of confusion, is one of the most valuable things one person can do for another. If you are in a marriage right now where something feels wrong and you can't quite name it, where the floor feels slightly unsolid beneath you, and you keep telling yourself it's in your head, I want you to know that the feeling is information. You are not being emotional. You are not being difficult. You are noticing something, and you are allowed to look at it directly. And if you are sitting on a kitchen floor right now, or in a parking garage, or in a dentist's waiting room, I want you to know that I sat there too. I know how long that floor feels. I know how solid and impossible the next step looks from down there. You will get up. I promise you, you will get up. If any part of this story stayed with you, or if you've been through something that made this feel familiar, I want to hear about it in the comments. Not because these stories are easy to tell, but because every time someone tells one, it gives someone else permission to tell theirs. That's the only reason I'm telling mine.